For centuries, royal families believed their blood was sacred. They claimed it carried divine power, a gift from God that set them above ordinary people. But in their pursuit to keep this blood pure, they created something far darker than they could imagine. Behind gilded palaces and jeweled crowns, a silent curse was growing, one that would haunt queens, princesses, and empresses for generations. Inbreeding was not just accepted in royal courts, it was celebrated. Marriages were arranged between cousins, uncles, nieces, and sometimes even siblings, all to prevent outsiders from claiming the throne. To them, it was a strategy, a way to preserve power, property, and legacy. But nature has rules, and breaking them comes at a cost. Over time, hidden weaknesses began to show. Bodies grew frail, minds became clouded. Entire bloodlines carried illnesses that ordinary people rarely faced. Some of the most powerful women in history suffered because of this system. Their lives may have been wrapped in silks and diamonds, but their bodies carried pain no crown could hide. They were admired in portraits, honored in ceremonies, yet whispered about in corridors for their strange appearances, sudden illnesses, or infertility. Doctors struggled to explain what was happening. But today we know the truth. The royal obsession with purity created generations of women trapped in genetic prisons. Imagine being a princess raised to believe you were chosen by destiny, only to discover that your own family's choices had doomed you to sickness. That was the reality for many. Some could not walk properly. Some suffered from seizures. Others carried the burden of being unable to bear children, a tragedy in royal courts where heirs were everything. This story is not just about science or genetics. It's about power, control, and the price women paid for decisions made by men desperate to hold on to crowns. These women were victims of a system that valued bloodlines over health, appearances over well-being. Their names are written in history, but rarely with compassion. They are remembered as weak, odd, or cursed, when in reality, they were the tragic products of royal obsession. The most haunting part? Some of these women were among the most famous queens and princesses in European history. Their portraits hang in museums. Their names appear in textbooks. But behind the polished surface lies a darker truth. A truth that was hidden for centuries, until modern science revealed the cost of royal inbreeding. And one of the most striking examples begins with a queen whose powerful dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own blood. Her story shows how a family's obsession with purity not only destroyed her life, but also shook an empire. Royal families often believed that keeping their blood pure was essential to maintain their power, wealth, and claim to the throne. To them, marrying outsiders, especially those without royal blood, was a threat to the legitimacy of their dynasty. This obsession created a dangerous cycle where cousins, uncles, nieces, and sometimes even siblings were forced into marriage to preserve the royal line. One of the most infamous examples comes from the Habsburg dynasty, which ruled large parts of Europe for centuries. They were notorious for repeated intermarriages within their own family. Generations of unions between close relatives were seen as a political strategy to unite kingdoms and prevent disputes. But what began as a political tool slowly became a genetic trap. Children born from these unions often carried the physical and mental consequences of inbreeding. Doctors centuries later would recognize the genetic disorders that plagued many royal families. But at the time, kings and queens considered it a necessary sacrifice. The irony is that what they thought would protect their dynasty ultimately destroyed it. By refusing to bring in new bloodlines, they planted the seeds of their downfall. This practice was not limited to Europe alone. In Egypt, the famous Ptolemaic dynasty descendants of Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy married siblings for generations. Cleopatra herself was the product of such unions, and she also married her own brother as tradition demanded. While these marriages reinforced power at the top, they created a fragile dynasty that struggled with hidden health issues. To the outside world, these queens and princesses lived in palaces and wore jewels. But behind the walls, many lived lives filled with suffering, able to escape marriages they did not choose, carrying illnesses they did not understand, paying the price for a tradition that turned their own blood into their curse. But the question remains, who were the women who carried the heaviest burdens of this inbred legacy? The Habsburg dynasty is often remembered as one of Europe's most powerful ruling families, but their women bore the heaviest price of its obsession with inbreeding. For centuries, the Habsburgs married close relatives, cousins, uncles, nieces, all in the name of keeping their empire intact. But while the empire spread across Austria, Spain, and the Holy Roman territories, the bloodline grew weaker, and nowhere was this decline more visible than in its women. One of the most striking examples is Maria Anna of Spain, the daughter of King Philip III. She was married to her uncle, Emperor Ferdinand III, in a match designed to secure Habsburg power. At first, courtiers praised her as intelligent and politically savvy, but the toll of her family's genetics soon became clear. Maria Anna struggled with fragile health, chronic illnesses, and a weak constitution. Each pregnancy became a dangerous gamble, and though she produced heirs, her frailty was whispered about in European courts as a sign of the Habsburg decline. Another victim was Margaret Teresa of Spain. It's often remembered today because of her haunting presence in Diego's famous painting, Las Meninas. Margaret Teresa was betrothed to her maternal uncle, Emperor Leopold I, when she was still a child. Their marriage further tightened the genetic knot of the Habsburg dynasty. Though she bore children, only one survived infancy, and Margaret herself died at just 21 years old after years of illness. Her early death became a tragic symbol of how the family's blood strategy destroyed its women. Perhaps the most tragic figure, however, was Maria Antonia of Austria, who carried not only the burden of inbreeding, but also the responsibility of producing heirs in a dynasty desperate for survival. She was the daughter of Margaret Teresa and Leopold, the first making her the child of an uncle-niece union. Maria Antonia was plagued by severe health problems from birth. Her frailty was so apparent that many doubted she would live to adulthood. Though she did marry, her only child died young, and she herself died at just 23. The dynasty's obsession with purity had produced women who were little more than vessels of genetic weakness, doomed to short, painful lives. The Habsburg women became living proof that royal power could not defy biology. Their pale skin, fragile bodies, and sickly appearances were whispered about across Europe. In their portraits, artists often exaggerated their beauty, but the reality was far darker. Behind the silks and jewels lay fragile bodies, broken by centuries of incestuous unions. These women were not just pawns in politics, they were sacrifices, their suffering hidden beneath crowns and pearls. The Habsburgs believed they were securing their dynasty's future by keeping power in the family. Instead, they created a legacy of tragedy, one where women became silent victims of a family curse. Their deaths were not simply personal misfortunes. They marked the crumbling of a royal line that could not escape its own obsession. But the Habsburgs were not the only dynasty to fall victim to inbreeding. In another corner of Europe, a royal family would take the same dangerous path, producing women whose lives reveal the same dark truth. Few monarchs have shaped history as dramatically as Henry VIII, the infamous Tudor king known for his 6 marriages, the English Reformation, and his ruthless consolidation of power. But behind his larger-than-life image, historians have long debated whether Henry was also silently ravaged by syphilis. By his later years, Henry's body had become a prison. He was obese, suffered from painful ulcers on his legs, and often lashed out with explosive anger. Some contemporaries whispered about his inability to father healthy sons, suggesting a hidden illness. Was it simply poor health, or was syphilis slowly corroding the king from within? The Tudor court was a world of rumors and secrets. Physicians at the time lacked both the courage and the medical knowledge to diagnose such a shameful disease in a monarch. Publicly, they blamed his condition on imbalances of humors. But private letters hint that his ailments were far more sinister. His paranoia, mood swings, and violent temper fit chillingly well with the later stages of syphilis, known to attack the brain and alter behavior. Whether or not Henry truly had the disease, the suspicion itself changed how his story is told. His brutal decisions, ordering executions, discarding wives, and reshaping religion are sometimes reinterpreted through this possible lens of illness. Could syphilis have played a hidden role in altering the course of English history? The truth remains uncertain. No remains of Henry have ever been tested, and Tudor courtiers had every reason to hide such a scandal from the world. But the image of England's most infamous king, sitting on his throne while potentially carrying a secret infection, continues to fascinate and disturb historians to this day. And Henry was not alone. Across Europe, other powerful rulers were rumored to have carried the same dark affliction. Some tried to hide it, while others left behind evidence in their decline. So who was next? The trail leads to a French king whose erratic behavior and tragic downfall shocked his people. King George IV, who ruled Britain in the early 19th century, was one of the most extravagant monarchs in history. His reign was marked by luxury, excess, and a lifestyle that drained the nation's finances. But beneath the glittering facade of palaces, jewels, and feasts, George carried a private torment. Many historians believe that he, too, suffered from syphilis, a disease that symbolized both his reckless appetites and the hidden shame of the aristocracy. George was known for his endless affairs, often with actresses, courtesans, and even the wives of his closest allies. His indulgence in drink and gluttony only added to his declining health. Reports from physicians of the time suggest that George endured symptoms consistent with syphilis, chronic pain, ulcers, and what his doctors referred to as mental agitation. As with other royals, his condition was masked behind vague medical notes. Official records rarely acknowledge sexually transmitted infections, as such admissions could humiliate the monarchy. Instead, George's failing health was attributed to gout, or dropsy. Convenient terms used to protect the dignity of a king. Despite his public image as a figure of grandeur, the creator of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, and the lavish patron of the arts, George's private life was far from glamorous. His addiction to pleasure destroyed his body and his reputation. By the time he was crowned king, his health was already in rapid decline. Contemporary accounts describe him as bloated, barely able to walk, and prone to fits of paranoia. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was disastrous, filled with public scandals and accusations of infidelity on both sides. This George's story reflects the double life of Victorian and Georgian royalty, dazzling on the outside, diseased within. For the public, he was the image of majesty. But behind closed doors, he was another victim of a disease that silently haunted the throne. His suffering reminds us that wealth and power offered no protection from the realities of unchecked indulgence and the spread of venereal disease. What makes George IV's case particularly tragic is how his personal weakness shaped an era. His extravagance left Britain with crushing debts, while his inability to rule effectively deepened public resentment toward the monarchy. In the end, he became a symbol not of strength, but of excess, and the hidden decay that came with it. If George IV's life exposed the costs of indulgence, the next royal story reveals how syphilis could tear apart an entire dynasty. Because in the glittering courts of Europe, this disease was not only personal, it could reshape the very course of history. In 17th century Russia, whispers about the royal family rarely reached the public ear. Illness and scandal were kept behind the high walls of the Kremlin. Yet one rumor echoed for centuries that Tsarevich Alexia, or Tsar Alexis, and half-brother to Peter the Great, may have fallen victim to the silent plague of syphilis. Court records describe Alexia as frail, nervous, and often confined to bed. Chronic fevers, lesions, and periods of delirium were noted in letters exchanged between foreign ambassadors. While some historians suggest tuberculosis, others point to symptoms closely resembling venereal disease. How could a young royal, destined for the throne, suffer from such an ailment? The truth may lie in the reckless culture of the Russian court. While Europe's kings flaunted their mistresses openly, Moscow's royals lived under stricter moral codes. But behind the curtains, secret affairs and arranged encounters with courtesans were common. For a prince like Alexei, exposure to these circles was almost inevitable. His condition worsened with age. By his mid-20s, he experienced bouts of insanity that left him unable to govern. Chronic pain kept him away from the court, and whispers spread that the Tsarevich was cursed. Some suggested poisoning, others witchcraft. Yet physicians of the time often noted the French disease, a term commonly used for syphilis, without ever daring to write it plainly in official records. The shame was so great that the Romanov family carefully concealed his decline. But his suffering shaped history in unexpected ways. Alexei's weakness paved the way for Peter the Great to rise uncontested, transforming Russia into a modern empire. In a cruel twist, one man's hidden illness altered the destiny of a nation. The case of Alexei reveals more than just royal fragility. It exposes how disease, especially syphilis, was buried beneath layers of secrecy, silence, and stigma. For royal courts, admitting to such an infection would have been political suicide, and so history was rewritten to cover the truth. For royals, syphilis was not only a physical burden, but also a political weapon. In an age when monarchy symbolized strength, health, and divine favor, the revelation that a king or queen carried a venereal disease could shake the foundation of their rule. Whispers spread quickly, and rival courts often used these rumors to undermine power. King Henry VIII's rumored syphilis is a prime example. Whether he truly had the disease or not, the speculation was enough to tarnish his reputation. His erratic decisions executing wives, splitting from the Catholic Church, and drastically changing England's religious structure were, at times, blamed on his failing health. Some historians argue that accusations of syphilis were even weaponized by his enemies to frame him as both immoral and unstable. For other monarchs, the disease was a hidden scandal. The French Bourbon dynasty had multiple figures suspected of carrying syphilis, and enemies of the crown often exaggerated these claims to weaken the monarchy's image. Similarly, in Spain, whispers about King Charles II being cursed were fueled by his grotesque physical deformities, some of which were attributed to generations of inbreeding, but also tied, in public rumor, to venereal disease. The stigma was especially destructive because it tied royalty to sin. Kings and queens were meant to be chosen by God, examples of purity and strength. Yet syphilis was widely recognized as a disease of the brothels, associated with immorality, lust, and shame. For a monarch to be linked to it was to strip away that divine aura. And yet, rather than admit to the disease, many rulers doubled down on secrecy. They hid symptoms behind heavy makeup, controlled court rumors with harsh punishments, and used loyal physicians who were sworn to silence. But still, cracks formed. Diplomats whispered. Enemies spread tales. Pamphlets circulated in underground networks, mocking diseased monarchs as cursed and unfit to rule. The political fallout could even extend to foreign policy. If a king was rumored to be dying of syphilis, rival states might push harder in negotiations, sensing weakness. Succession crises loomed larger when heirs were suspected to be born of diseased blood. The very stability of dynasties could hinge on whether these whispers of sickness were believed. For the royals themselves, the shame was crushing. They lived in golden palaces, draped in jewels, worshipped by their subjects but behind closed doors. They feared being exposed as carriers of a disease that society despised. But how did the stigma shape the next generation of royals? And what long-lasting effects did syphilis leave on the very bloodlines of Europe's greatest dynasties? By the 18th and 19th centuries, syphilis was no longer whispered about in the shadows of medieval courts. It had become a grim inheritance of dynasties. Its spread was not confined to a single throne or kingdom. Across Europe, the disease seeped silently into the ruling bloodlines, altering the course of history. Kings, queens, and princes were not spared. Their crowns could not protect them from the cruel hand of nature. The tragedy was not only in the suffering, but also in how syphilis destabilized the politics of entire nations. When a ruler was weakened by illness, power struggles followed, heirs were contested, and enemies waited eagerly for the kingdom to stumble. The disease did not just torment bodies, it influenced wars, marriages, and the fate of empires. Whispers about rulers' health carried weight in a time when monarchy was absolute. If a king was rumored to be insane, as often happened in late-stage syphilis, it could trigger revolts. Some royal figures became infamous for erratic behavior, wild bursts of rage, strange obsessions, or sudden collapses of judgment. Historians now suspect syphilis was the hidden culprit behind these unexplained changes. And yet, courtiers and doctors alike concealed the truth, preferring to blame melancholia, madness, or divine punishment, rather than admit the shameful truth of venereal disease. The royal mask had to remain unbroken. Dynasties also tried to maintain their image through portraits. Oil paintings of rulers presented flawless skin, rosy cheeks, and noble posture. Behind these painted lies, however, were bodies ravaged by ulcers, swollen joints, and failing minds. The contradiction between the canvas and the truth reveals the desperate need of monarchies to appear eternal, even as syphilis ate away at their bloodlines. What mattered was not reality but perception. After all, who would obey a king whose face bore the sores of a prostitute's disease? But beneath a powder, perfume, and politics, the suffering was real. In letters and secret diaries, some royals left clues about their torment, the headaches that would not stop, the unhealed wounds, the nights without rest. Their voices were silenced publicly, but privately they wrote of despair. Some even feared damnation, convinced their illness was a punishment from God. As history moved forward, syphilis became a hidden force shaping who ruled and who fell. The disease was not just in the bedchamber. It was in the throne room, in the treaties signed under trembling hands, in the wars declared by unstable minds, a silent player in the theater of kings and queens. And yet, the darkest question remains. How many royal legacies, how many heirs, alliances, and nations were destroyed not by sword or rebellion, but by the slow, secret poison of syphilis? By the dawn of the 20th century, syphilis had left its bloody fingerprints across the royal families of Europe. Kings and queens, those who were seen as near godlike, were slowly stripped of their illusion of invulnerability. Their private shame was now public history. Behind the velvet curtains and golden crowns, they had been prisoners of the same disease that plagued peasants in the gutters. This truth shattered the aura of divine protection once wrapped around monarchs. The disease didn't just kill bodies, it killed dynasties. It warped bloodlines, created unstable heirs, and left kingdoms weak in times when strength was needed most. Historians now trace political instability, wars of succession, and even major reforms back to the silent destruction caused by syphilis in royal courts. The disease, once whispered about in dark corners, had shaped the fate of nations. But the legacy of syphilis among royals goes beyond history books. It serves as a reminder of vulnerability, secrecy, and the cost of denial. These rulers, who thought themselves untouchable, were undone not by armies or revolutions, but by an invisible affliction they tried to hide. Their desperation to mask the truth only made the suffering worse, ensuring that their downfall became even more humiliating when exposed. The story of syphilis in royal courts forces us to see history in a different light. Behind every grand portrait of a monarch painted in rich robes and jeweled crowns there might have been a body riddled with pain, scars, and decay. Behind every confident gaze was perhaps a ruler haunted by disease, fear, and shame. Today, medical advancements mean syphilis can be treated with a simple antibiotic. But for royals of the past, it was a silent executioner, leaving kingdoms shaken and dynasties forever scarred. And so the question lingers: how much of the world we live in today was shaped not by kings' choices, but by the disease slowly killing them in secret? The silence of their suffering echoes through time. It reminds us that even the most powerful people in history were fragile, and that behind every crown lies a hidden story of pain.